it's not just about like checking boxes here. This is like, to me, I think, again, where artists can go so wrong. And I know it's where I went super wrong for a long time, is that you start to, when you lose that sense of kind of curiosity and discovery and exploring in what you're doing, right? Like that real sort of pioneering sense of every single creative thing that you're doing, whether that's writing or acting or music. And it's like, I'm here to discover what this is, right? That sense of, I don't know what this is, I'm here to discover it.
This is Way of the Artist with Brandon Colby Cook and Evan Schulte.
Exploring the challenges of the creative call
so that you can claim your own path
and make your life a work of art. All right, folks, here we are. We're doing a not that anybody usually knows when we record these things, but we're doing a night podcast, which is not usual, but it's nice, different vibe. We didn't really have a pre-discussion about this one, but I had something that I had kind of just chewing in my mind from last night. Actually, I thought I would just throw it out there. We'll see where it goes. So I had a rare moment in my life to just throw on like a show of my own choosing. My kid was asleep. Wife went to bed as well. I was like, oh, what should I do? Let me watch something. I was in the mood for like a Western. I was like, I want to see some kind of a Western thing and not something that I've seen before. And so I went and I checked out this show that it kind of caught my eye a while ago, but I just never got into it. And it's called The English. And it's Emily Blunt is in this thing. And there's like, you look at the cast in this thing, and you're like, holy shit, look at all these people in here. It's a British series, from what I understand. And I was kind of expecting, like one of those sort of big budget, bright, colorful streamer shows, kind of probably Western. This is going to be action heavy. It's going to be, it had enough of the right people involved that I thought, it's like, yeah, it'll probably be above average, right? Check it out. And I start watching this thing, and I'm immediately going, holy shit, this is not what I thought it was going to be. There is this slowed down pace to this show that I was really not expecting. Now, there's a ton of shit that happens in it, but there was this sense of patience with a lot of these scenes and these characters, and there'd be these dialogues that went on just longer than you see. Like, I think you used to see this more so, but today you rarely see these scenes just get this space to kind of just develop and reveal things and stuff to just sort of happen, interesting moments. And I was just like, holy shit, as an actor, I'm just like, oh, this would be a dream. Like, this is the kind of dream material, something that you would be so honored to be cast in and to be involved with. And like there's like there's a specific scene that I'll just kind of point out in it that I feel is like can draw a bit of a contrast or make a bit of a comparison reference to. And it's this scene where there's like this guy, he's like handcuffed and he's being brought on a carriage by this guy to like the next town. He's being kind of kicked out of where he was. And it's just these two guys out in the middle of like just nowhere country in like Oklahoma. And they each spot in the distance, they see this like dust and glimmer in the distance. It's somebody is coming towards them, right? There's somebody who's coming up behind them and they don't know who it is. They're like, it could be, they're like, it could be the natives. It could be, it could be outlaws, it could be anybody, right? And they're like, well, we can't outrun them. So they just stop the cart and they just sit there and they start having this conversation with each other. And there's this and these guys are still coming, but they just take this time for these guys to have this conversation before it gets to this sort of, tense, suspenseful action kind of moment, right? And I was just like, man, so many shows would just wouldn't even really have that scene of them having a conversation with each other. They would just oh, we're being followed. All right, get yourself ready. And then boom, it would just be immediately to whoever it is arriving. This space that was prevalent in every single scene in this. And I've only watched the first episode and I'm just I'm super pumped about it because oh, this feels so good to see a show like this right now. And it got me thinking about how creativity and real interesting, original, compelling, this stuff all happens when there's a lot of space. It doesn't happen when it's rushed and it's forced or it's, so there was something in that was kind of going in my head about that's what is it about creating space that makes that creativity thrives in? So that's my opening remarks, Brandon.
Well, that's a good one, Evan. That's really good. Man, well, where do you even go with that? I have a lot of thoughts. A couple episodes we were talking about creativity in the mundane, and I've been thinking about that a lot because, I've been working pretty much every day on this novel, which every day for months now. And it started off as it was going to be a feature film. Then it just evolved and I'm like, nah, this is going to be a novel. I still want it to be a feature or a television series eventually, but I'm in that realm. And it's interesting. I did take a couple weeks off, which I haven't done for months because I've just been working this and working it. And it's really dialed in, I feel, at this point. But I picked it up today and I was like, okay, let's get back into this. Let's revisit the work and let's work through. Because there's this one last little or several last little structural things I'm just kind of sorting out just to make sure everything is just rock solid, totally put together. Everything's tight, well thought out. There's always these little things that come up, but there was just what I find when I'm creating a story. I'm going to just preface it with this, is I write and then I'm like, oh, this is really good. I'm really happy with this. Or, maybe I'm like, it's kind of shitty. Something's not working. It doesn't feel right. But I'll go to have these moments of silence. And in these moments of silence where, there's space, I guess, I start thinking about it. I'm like, well, I guess that idea isn't really worked out. So what would that mean? Where could I go with that? And then I'll start to think about it. And so for example, there's an inciting incident that happens in the story, which is the kind of the moment where we turn from the character's normal life into the actual pressing moment of the story for people who don't know. So this moment I find so many times in shows and movies and just particularly Hollywood stuff, it's just so forced, particularly that and the hook. And the hook is usually that first page or that first 10 pages, this first initial, it's just oh, we're going to show you something later in the movie. And then you'll find out how we got there. And that's just so cliche and so boring. And it's just, it's not interesting. Right. And, what I'm finding is when I come up with an idea, if it feels cliche or it feels common, or I feel like I've seen it somewhere, I'm like, yeah, that just needs to be reworked. So I was working on this story forever and I had an inciting incident and it was getting me into the story and it was fine. It worked. But there was a certain point, and this was, I'd say several weeks ago, where I was just like, hey, I got to rework the inciting incident. It's just not, it's not awesome. And so then I'm laying in bed, I'm having a shower, these thoughts are coming to my mind. And there's I don't want to give too much away, but basically there's all these suicides that are happening. And our detective is like, I don't think these are suicides. I think these are homicides, and I think they're being made to look like suicides. And he's like, I don't know how they're doing it, but something is wrong. And no one really believes him. People are like, well, the evidence is circumstantial. We don't really know. So he can't get the thing moved forward, and he can't pin it on anything. He can't get any type of real lead. But I was like, well, I need to make an exciting, inciting incident. Yeah, it's hard to say. But I also need to make it personal. I need to make it interesting. It needs to be something that's never been done before. And I started to realize, I'm like, okay, well, let's go back to some of the fundamentals. Relationship. Let's make it personal. And so then I started reworking in this idea that one of these suicides was someone who was like a childhood friend of his. So they grew apart. They're totally in different lives now. They're older now. And this person hasn't even committed suicide in the beginning of the story, but they find them having committed suicide. But now, because he knows who this guy is personally, him and his sister, they were played as children together. It creates this real personal kind of we got to get to the fucking bottom of this, because if we don't, these are the people we love. People are being he shouldn't have committed suicide. We knew about that, right? So this was kind of what's going on. And then I was like, okay, well, there's this whole other plot line. I have these subplots that need to be integrated into the story. And when you start getting into advanced storytelling and you're interweaving subplots into the main plot, and you still are trying to make everything feel real and on point and not plot driven, but character driven, I'm like, I need to move the plot forward. I need to move this subplot forward, and it has to be character driven. So his son is who he's not spending enough time with, is kind of going towards what's basically in the story, anti-establishment group, right? And he has a girlfriend who's tied up in them and all this. And so I have this scene where him and his son are together, and I'm like, well, what if he gets because I'm like, what if he gets this call from his childhood friend, but he's with his son, and he doesn't want to not pay attention to his son, so he doesn't take the call. Had he taken the call, it might have saved this person's life, which kind of drives him to be later in the story why he's kind of putting his family second, seemingly, because in his world, he believes he's saving their lives. He's saving them from a future where they can just be knocked off and made it look like they just committed suicide. There's a lot of details in the story, and I won't get into them all. But the point is that the events that occur happen in this type of space, where he's out there with his son. They're having a day. There's, it's not quite, he can't quite connect with his son, and he gets this call. And if he takes it, he destroys everything he's trying to build with his son. But at the same time, the most important thing, seemingly most important thing is this case, and he's on to something, and he really believes he's going to change a lot of things in society if he can just figure out what the hell's going on here. And so him turning down the call shows us he loves his son. He's going to choose his son first. That's more important to him. But it comes at the cost of actually having his friend die and him not being able to save him, which later creates this whole whirlwind of connecting everything. It all means something now, because as an audience member, you're going to be like, oh man, if he just took the call, he would have saved his life. But also, it's it all seems like it's just flowing and it's happening. You know what I mean? And what I'm finding is these events that occur, they don't need to be grand things. They just need to have meaning, and they need to be personal. And all of a sudden you make it like sitting there in that wagon. Let me just go back to your story. Sitting there in that wagon, seeing this, someone run up on you in the distance, and you see the dust, and you don't know if it's dangerous. You don't know what it is. And you're there, and you're living that. And the thing is I feel like there's so much room to play in let's live this. Let's see what happens here, And modern storytelling, I think, is, in my opinion, at least a lot of mainstream stuff, it's watered down. It's kind of weak, because they're always trying to go to the big, like razzle dazzle, like flashy fight scene, whatever. And I've been looking at a lot of these like great stories and movies, and I've just been rewatching. I'm like, you know what? A lot of the best movies are not like that. Actually, most of the worst movies use those types of techniques. But if you look at like all these great movies, and I'm sure it's the same with novels, and I could go on, but they tend to happen almost seamlessly. Like, I say almost seamlessly because if you don't know what to look for, you won't even see it. But the ones where they're kind of clunky, you can kind of see the seams. And the way, for somebody who doesn't watch like a lot of movies or like read a lot of books and just consume story as much as I do, you know it's happening. It's like an innate knowledge. You're like, oh, well, I guess this is when this happens. You just know, like, and you don't even have to be that experienced with story. You just kind of know. And then when it happens, you're like, oh, it was cool, but you're not surprised. You don't have that thrill feeling. You don't have that, like, that tension feeling. And what I love about the short story you shared in that space is that even as you're telling it, I was thinking about it. I'm like, yeah, that creates a feeling, and that's what I'm after. And I think, so I guess I'll leave it on this. In the space is where that feeling can exist. And that's what we're really trying to do as creatives.
Yeah, it's like in so many ways, especially within storytelling, movie making, that kind of stuff. It's like there's this giant misunderstanding of what it is that we actually really like and really want in our stories. You know, it's like character, like so often character is done in some weird expository way, or just in some really ham-fisted kind of way. It's just like, oh, this is who this character is, right? Like, I'm a plucky, I'm a plucky, never get me down person, and we're going to show it in some really obtuse way, right? Like, it's like, oh, can we just get revealing who this character is out of the way so that we can get to the action sequences, like just like the big CG smorgasbord kind of crap. And it's like, that's not really the thing that we really want. Like, that's nice. We do enjoy that. We do want that on a certain level. But if there's no meaning to it, if we don't give a shit about the people who are involved in the big CG explosion on screen, like, it's then it's like it all becomes so forgettable. Right? It's like, oh yeah, there was a big battle scene, but I don't know. I don't even really remember what happened in the whole thing, but those moments where you actually really do the freaking work, and that, it's not just about like checking boxes here. This is like, to me, I think, again, where artists can go so wrong. And I know it's where I went super wrong for a long time, is that you start to, when you lose that sense of kind of curiosity and discovery and exploring in what you're doing, right? Like that real sort of pioneering sense of every single creative thing that you're doing, whether that's writing or acting or music. And it's like, I'm here to discover what this is, right? That sense of, I don't know what this is. I'm here to discover it, right? Because like the thing that gets you into it, that's just that's just the little piece that got you into going down the path. You don't really know the thing yet. You've got it, and it's that discovery that you need, as opposed to something to be executed to a certain degree. And not that execution isn't a part of what you do as an artist, but it's like that exploration comes first, right? Like what is this actually, like what is actually going on in here? Because that, coming back to the scene that I gave as an example there, like that's a writer and a director, and it's like, let's explore this whole thing. Because kind of coming back to like, well, isn't that just the boring part, the mundane, them sitting, waiting, nothing's happening. It's like, but so much is happening. You have two people sitting here, they might not be alive in 3 minutes, right? what would that be like when you just have to sit there? Like you can't outrun these people because they're on horses and you got like the carriage, like you're stuck. You're not getting away. You have to just confront this thing. And now you're just waiting to confront this thing. And what is going on inside you? What are the last words you're going to share with this person who you just kind of ended up with here? This might be one of the last human beings you ever talked to, right? That's fucking interesting. Like that is so compelling, but like so often that kind of stuff is just missed because it doesn't have that superficial layer of like, oh, the action and the guns and the, and the running around, whatever the hell it is. It doesn't have that same thing, but there's so much more that's happening there. That's so much more important that creates real, like the word that's often used, stakes, right? Like, because now as an audience member, I have emotional stakes because there's things that I now know about who these people are that now I care about what happens to them now, where I didn't necessarily care a whole ton about like definitely one of these characters. I didn't have much care about them at the beginning, but now I was like, oh, I kind of care about this person now. I see their humanity and now I have something, I have some skin in the game about like wanting this to go a certain way, not wanting anything bad to happen, right? And it's like that makes those the because there was a little action piece that followed this thing, but like it had weight to it. It had real weight to it because I have a sense of connection here. And that's the thing that is so us, is like that sense of connection to these characters. And it's like they might not look like you at all. They might not, be anything like who you are, but there's still some level of humanity that you get, so that you understand. That's kind of going off into another thing. But it was it was like a essay on sort of storytelling and movie, sort of how a lot of characters are put into movies now, and where it's like, it's all about everyone feeling like there's somebody on screen that represents them. Right. And it's like, I'm not going to completely shit on that whole idea, because I do think that there is value to that, but there's also value to you seeing somebody who's like seeing characters who are nothing like you, who look nothing like, whose lives resemble nothing like yours does, right? Like there's a lot that we can gain from having a sense of connection to somebody who comes from a completely different world, and exploring that through storytelling, right? Because in some way, every single person does reflect you and does represent you on some level. I mean, we all share so many things in common that go beyond just sort of our, I don't know, the masks that we wear in the world, right? That's really what, I'm getting into the fucking weeds here on this one. But anyhow, what I'm, I don't remember what my original thing was that I started on here, but just, yeah, it's like the things that make those moments meaningful, right? Like and this is something that I brought up it might've been that creativity in the mundane episode that we did, but yeah, what my, one of my acting teachers told me, which was, most of life is the in-between, right? Most of life is the in-between spaces between like those accomplishments and those heartbreaks. Most of our lives are in that in-between space. It's not very long that we actually are in the moments of triumph and the moments of heartbreak and whatever else it is. It's all of the things that happen in between those that actually make those moments what they are. Right. And I feel like sometimes like we want, or at least a lot of creatives and artists, it's like we're trying to force and rush the moment before it's ready, like it's not earned yet. You haven't created the meaning for that thing yet.
Well, there's some good stuff coming up in this one. Well, at least from a storytelling point of view, I can say this, like, if you don't have a period of normalcy where you establish what the characters' lives are like, you can make the wildest stuff happen, and it won't matter because we don't have a reference point. Like if you start wild and end wild, it's like, well, there's no juxtaposition. There's nothing separating it. And it's like, well, I'll use Alan Watts as a reference because this is where I learned this from. This is where this was really pointed out to me. But Alan Watts talks about how, like, what is a shape without its background? And if you think about that, it's a really good point, right? Because you're not even looking at the background. You don't even really think about the background a lot of the time. You're just looking at the shape and you go, well, what shape is that? And you go, oh, it's a square, it's a circle, a triangle, whatever it is. But the thing is that without the background, you wouldn't be able to tell because it would all just blend into the same thing. And this is kind of like the mundane, the space, the silence, the listening, all of these things, the stillness, however you want to put it, all of that gives context to the movement, to the loud noise, to the whatever is happening, right? So, if you want, for example, if you want a sound to resonate and impact or startle, then it has to be silence, or it has to be something that's going to offset that, so that when it happens, it hits you suddenly. If I know the sound or shock sound is coming, I'm not going to be shocked because I'm already aware of it. One of the big things, like I said earlier that, there's some problems with storytelling today, and there are. But there's also some of the best storytelling that's being told today as well. And I don't want to undermine that because looking back, like I was watching like some old 90s movies and I was like, oh man, these are cheesy and they're not really well thought out. And they're just like, they're bad. Like, I mean, I remember a movie that I watched when I was a kid and my family and I watched it and we all had a lot of fun and whatever, but it's called Tremors and it's on Netflix right now. So I watched a little bit of it and I'm like, man, this is cheesy and corny and campy and just like, it's not even really well thought out. Like, how does this even work, right? Like, apparently there's these monsters that are swimming underground and it's like, but how does that even work? Anyway, whatever. So you just kind of got to let that go. And there's just a lot of cheese in it, right? And I was thinking about it and I'm like, well, back then when you were making a movie or you were getting a movie made, it was a lot about just this was considered high concept. Tremors was considered high concept. Yeah. Think about it. Because the thing is like they needed a new monster to be able to attack you in a way that has never been done before. Any movie or any story that was the first of its kind that came out is considered high concept. And it's harder and harder to become high concept now because a lot of people they've already kind of found the territory that was unexplored. If you look at, the movie Psycho. I mean, if you haven't seen that movie, you really need to see it. It's great. Hitchcock. Anyway, scared people of being in the shower for so long. I mean, because and I've studied that film a lot and I've read papers on it and listened to reviewers talk about it, and it's endless because there's so much in it. But one of the big successes of that particular movie was that you're having a shower. There's a sense of safety and vulnerability. You're naked, You're in your own little bubble, right? And you're trapped, you're cornered, right? There's all these things that you don't think about. And then all of a sudden someone comes in there and attacks you and you have nothing to defend yourself. You have no clothes as even nothing as armor, and you're cornered and you can't get away. And there's only probably one way out, really. And all of a sudden you took a very mundane thing, which is the bathroom, and you made it the scariest place in the world. And that's a very interesting thing, right? Monster under the bed. That wasn't always a thing. You know what I mean? Like these ideas, to our own detriment, creativity can put really horrific ideas in our heads that were never there. If you're into horror and that type of stuff, right? But I mean, they can all do it, and it's there's this scene in for example, in Pet Sematary, and granted, it is kind of near the climax of the story, but in the original film, Stephen King, I don't know if Stephen King directed it, but Stephen King's original version of the film, Pet Sematary, because it was later remade, there's this little kid, and anyway, at one point, the guy's walking by the bed, and the little kid takes out like a scalpel and cuts his Achilles tendon from under the bed. And ever since I've seen that scene, man, there's like, if I really want to creep myself out, I think of, what's under the bed? Like putting my foot too close to it. And like, there was a period of time after that movie where when I got close to a bed, I just wanted to hop onto it. Like, I didn't even want to let my feet hang out underneath and I knew there was nothing there, but it was just so visceral and real in my mind. The point is that I think I guess I'm on horror for right now, but like, if you wanted to make something scary, it's not the big bad monster that looks super creepy. It's the make me feel safe and show me I'm not safe somewhere I think I'm safe. That's really scary, And there's all sorts of ways to enhance our experience without doing this grand thing. It can be quite simple. And so I guess what I'm taking at this point in this conversation is that find that space that is a little bit, and I love this because it kind of does carry on from that episode we had a couple ago, which is like creativity in the mundane. It's like, find stuff where you wouldn't usually think to look. Like, if you look at a lot of the best stuff, it occurs kind of in this like area where we're like, well, it can't get me there, right? And it's like, no, it can. All of a sudden, you weren't even thinking it could get you there. And all of a sudden you're like, whoa, now that's dangerous too. So now it's like, well, the closet's dangerous, under the bed's dangerous, the shower's dangerous, the dark is dangerous, all this stuff's dangerous, right? All of a sudden, now if you look at, say, modern, I'll say this one last thing. If you look at modern horror filmmakers, they'll use the things, they'll stand on the shoulders of the giants before. So they'll use under the bed, they'll use the closet, they'll use the darkness, they'll use all the things that someone already established, but they don't realize that, like, you can make the dark scary again in a whole new way. You don't have to just kind of like go like, okay, we need the next big thing because everyone's already done this, so we can't do that again. It's like, well, no, you can. You can, but like maybe you need to do it a different way. Maybe you need to look at it in some new perspective, Mm-hmm. Okay, this is my last thought. You're not going to come up with these ideas unless you sit with it.
That's great that you brought that in as your last thought, because I was thinking about that earlier when you were talking about how, you needed to make your inciting incident, cook a little bit more. And it wasn't like I sat down and I grinded it out. It was like, no, I was out walking. I was thinking about it. I was in the shower. I was thinking about it. Like it's like, it's this thing that's just building. It's sitting in there and developing. Right. And it's, there's a great line from Mad Men from Don Draper, which is like, despite all of his many faults in this thing, there are some things that Don was actually kind of a genius about. And one of his lines where he was actually giving advice, I think it was to Peggy, who was coming up in the what do they call themselves in marketing? Yeah, like yeah. And he said, think about it intensely and then let it go. And then you have to completely take a step, like totally step back from it. Like it's like it gets, if you want to think about it in a, I guess, a biological kind of way, it's like it gives your subconscious time to like put pieces together. It's what your subconscious does. It's actually very good at at figuring out pretty complex things, right? It's like when things click, right? That's usually because something subconscious has now been kind of delivered up the chain into your conscious mind. It's like, okay, we have this ready for you, right? It's like, oh, wow. Like, where did this thing come? And in a way, it's like you have to put your conscious mind to like put in a request. You know, you think about the thing and you put in the request to the subconscious, like, okay, I'll work on it. I'll get back to you. But you got to have the, I'll get back to you. You got to allow room for that. Cause it's like, you can't, because that's not something that you can force. Right. But when it's delivered, it's something that you wouldn't have been able to come up with otherwise. Right. And yeah, that's one of the fascinating parts of creativity. And I know it's also something that like Simon Sinek has, you know, kind of jokingly pointed out about a lot of companies, like big companies that he's worked with, where it's like, you know, well, what are your two biggest values in your company? And he says, it's crazy how many of them say creativity and efficiency. And he's like, those two are not compatible. Those are not, like, creativity is not necessarily efficient. Sometimes creativity happens quickly, but a lot of the times it does not. And there's, you know, it's just kind of our culture of how we approach things. It's like everything is a mile a minute and like first to market, gotta like just like fast food, fast, you know, entertainment, like on demand, all of this shit. Like we've lost our sense of value in space and patience and time, even though some part of us actually knows that it's really important. Because I don't know how many people I know and meet who are just like, oh, I just need some time. I just need some space. I just like, there's this whole thing of like, we know we just need this thing, right? Because we're like, yeah, this whole way of just like rush, go, now, more. There's something really toxic about that whole way of going about things and doing things. And it creates an interesting problem for the artist who comes up in this culture, because it's like you're trying to be creative genuinely and truly, which requires space, but you are surrounded by, it's just like, no, do it, get it out, put it there. And it's like we're, to a degree, and we're seeing a lot of the effects of that, right? Where it started, like you're saying, like the seams are showing, right? There's like, you can see the seams in like these, you know, movies and shows and whatever, because it's like, yeah, it's like we're just trying to rush content out there. We're just trying to get shit in front of people's eyes. And it all just starts to lose its meaning. It all just starts to lose its value for everybody. Right? To a point where it's like you can't even remember half the shit that you've even taken in. I'd be surprised if most people could remember half the shit that they've taken in media wise, right? Like I couldn't tell you probably most of the stuff that I've seen recently. A lot of it is just very forgettable, does not leave any kind of impression or mark. And I think that that's a huge symptom of just trying to rush things, right? And losing that sense of, as I was talking about before, like exploration. You know, like to me, that's one of the key aspects of being an artist and of being a creative. Like, it's not just about delivering a product. It's like there's an interest in you, in the person, in the artist, in going into something and just feeling around and searching and looking and discovering and going down different paths from a place of, again, genuine curiosity, just wanting to know what that looks like, or have an idea of what something might actually look like. And then you express it, right? And then you try and express it to the best of your ability. But that exploration part, that takes time, right? And it doesn't necessarily meet deadlines or anything like that. Like, I do think it's important that as artists you show up, you know, like Stephen Pressfield, right? Like, it's just like, yeah, like you got to show up and start doing the work, writing the words, and you're not always necessarily going to feel inspired about it. But like in that whole process, there's still this exploration, the sense of like, I don't fully know what this thing exactly is yet. Like, and we've talked about that before, where it's like, that's, at least in my perspective, that's an essential ingredient to creating something compelling. Is there needs to be that a space that you've left that doesn't know, right? That's like, okay, this is what I've got, but I don't really know what this thing is. Like, I've done enough work that will get me sort of like from the start to the finish, you know, and that's where creating some of those foundational things and learning craft, I think that's what it's really about. Like, your craft is just about creating that foundation for those things you don't know to happen, right? And to occur. And which is why, you know, like if you're writing a story, it's like, you know where you're starting, you know where this thing ends, you know, like you put certain things in place to just like, okay, this just will keep this thing on the rails. It'll keep me from getting totally stuck, right? Which is like the writer's block thing often happens because you're ill prepared. You came in too ill prepared for what you're doing. But there's still things that you're going to be like, holy shit, what? I don't know exactly how this whole thing is going to play out, right? And if you don't have that, I think that your shit is dead. Yeah. You know, like, and then from there you kind of, there's a refining process to a certain extent, but you've always got to retain a quality of, a position of, there are things here that I still don't know. Like, until the very bitter end of whatever it is that you're doing. Like, you always have to have that position, at least in my opinion.
One thing that I've discovered through novel writing is that you can always look closer. And this is something that it's just fascinating, because when you're writing a movie or a script for a movie, there's only a certain amount of closer you can do. Like, at a certain point, it doesn't matter anymore. It's like, it actually just gets in your way. So a lot of the time when you're writing a script, I mean, you can leave a lot of stuff out, but I think that's problematic. And I think that's why a lot of times storytelling for just screenwriters is often not as good as it is for novel writers, because as a novel writer, I'm not saying that all novelists are good, or all people who write novels are good at that. But when you write a novel, there's certain just details you have to take care of. And it's interesting, like, working through this process, because like, I'll write a chapter. I'm like, oh man, this is good. And I'm happy. But then it's like, okay, well, what if we looked at this? What if we looked at that? What if we look, and then, you know, and I'm like, yeah, but it's not really gonna, always tell myself the same thing. I'm like, it's not going to do anything. It doesn't matter. Like, let's do it anyway. It always leads to something incredible. And it's such a fascinating thing to me, because it's relatively new to me. Like, I'm not really, like, I haven't spent a lot of time novel writing. And because of that, I haven't spent a lot of time, like, exploring, for example, the thoughts of my characters, or the little things that are going around that they might not even be noticing, or, you know, just the details of the world and things like this. So like, when you're writing a screenplay, I'm sure you found this similar, Evan. It's like someone says something. So you have a scene, these events are happening. Okay, we're going from here to here, theoretically, or whatever. This is the conflict. However, you're going to launch off into this. And then that person says something. So you think, well, how would I respond to that based on the fact that I'm this character? And you're just kind of going with that, and these dialogue quips are happening, right? And you're responding, and when you get into the flow, they're talking and the dialogue starts to happen, and it starts to like just kind of ricochet off each other, and it gets really exciting and it's cool. But between those dialogue moments, if you stop to think, what is my character thinking and feeling in this moment? You're dead. It's done. It's over. Now you can kind of do that with screenwriting, with novel writing. But what's interesting about writing a novel is you have dialogue, and you don't necessarily have to give the next several lines of dialogue that happen between another key point of dialogue. So you can kind of like infer that they happen. And then one character says something, and then a bunch of stuff, you talk about it and you detail it, and then all of a sudden another character says something, and it's just assumed that the conversation was carrying on in between that, but the character just never mentioned what was being said because it was benign. It was like it almost didn't matter. But in a screenplay, it's because it's filmed and because we're getting most of the story through either what the characters actually do or what they say, we always have to see an action and we have to see a line of dialogue. So you don't get that room to breathe as much. You have to kind of keep it clipping along, and so you don't want any wasted words, and you want the dialogue to be meaningful. So you're actually cramming a lot of stuff into what might not be as natural as the conversation would unfold. But in a novel, you could have that conversation. It could be lasting a lot longer. Like it could be a 20-minute conversation. But as the reader experiencing it, you're experiencing a 20-minute conversation within a matter of several minutes. So you're cutting out how they got from one place to the next because it doesn't really matter. And it's an interesting thing, right? And, for example, like a character does something and you have a chance, whether you like to or not, you don't have to, but depending on the narrative that you're doing, meaning are you doing first person, second person, third person, like what are you doing? You can decide if you want to let the audience in on the thoughts. So for example, he's talking to his son. He doesn't have to say to his son, hey, I don't think I'm going to take this call. We just have that as a thought in his head. I don't want him to think that I don't care about him. And it's like that would be inferred in the script, but in the novel, you get to go into that a little bit, which could be very interesting. And so there's all sorts of stuff that can happen, right? And I think that from a creative point of view, if you actually like want to tell a good story or you want to create a great piece of art, what you're probably going to find is that you want to kind of sit with it. You want to spend time with it. I could have completed this novel already. I was going to actually finish writing it a few months ago, and I was just going to write it based on the draft and the outline and the treatment I had. And I was like, it's good. I'm ready to go. Let's do this. And it would have been pretty good. It was solid. But I just kept having these like nagging thoughts, like, well, let's think about this little part a little bit more. And then it would open up another door. And well, let's think about that a little bit more. And then something I wasn't thinking about, so let's think about that. And now it's so much better than where it was before. And and talk about timelines and deadlines and all of that stuff. Had I put a deadline, okay, we got to have this novel written by this date, and this is just how it is. It would have just really it would have been much more underwhelming. Like it just wouldn't have been what it is now. And like, even right now, like I have this kind of like, okay, well, I'll probably have this done in 2 weeks, and then I'll have that done in a month. And then, this thing should be pretty much ready to go in 3. It's like, I think that's what's going to happen, but I also don't know if that's what's going to happen. And I guess what I've kind of discovered through the novel writing process is I'm doing things for a much different reason at this point in my life. I'm not just trying to get something made or get something optioned or financed or just get funding behind it to make a movie. Like I'm not like, I am creating it because there's a story in me that needs to be told. And there's something in me that's like, I want to tell it the best way I can put it is I want to tell it right. I want to tell it the way it needs to be told. And it's not that I know how it needs to be told. I'm almost being told it as I sit with it, and then it's coming out. And this form of creativity has been it's been a very fulfilling experience. I also would say that the next novel that I write is going to happen most likely way faster, because I'm cutting my teeth on this one. Like, I'm really cutting my teeth here. So I'm working out things that I didn't know when I started, and now I kind of have them in my back pocket. I have these skills. Okay, one other thing I wanted to say, and I didn't want to forget about this. I worked with this acting teacher at one point, and she was like, I really thought she was really a good teacher at first, and then as I worked with her more, I really didn't like her methods, and I couldn't understand why the actors who were in her group were like good, but like underwhelming. Like I was like, I was pretty doing a lot as a director and a producer at that point. And I'm like, I don't know, these are pretty good actors, but like something about it. And I remember there was this day where she's like, don't move your hand. Don't do this. You're twitching. You're doing this. Like, and it's just like, you're making me think about myself fucking so much right now. All I'm thinking about is me and every little movement I'm making. I'm so self-focused right now. I'm not focused on the scene. I'm not doing anything. And I didn't quite understand it at the day, but I was like, what a terrible class that was. I was like, what the hell was happening there? And I started to realize, I'm like, all these actors, because she's pretty narcissistic, in my opinion. All these actors are narcissistic. Like they're approaching acting like thinking about themselves. And it's like, that's another thing is like, you don't need to know what you're going to do. Like what you're doing, I get what she was going for to a certain degree. Like I get how there's like, don't do anything unless there's a reason to do it. But there's these great nuances that come out of characters. And I learned this in film school. Like I had this teacher at one point and he said, well, do you notice that the actor is like tapping their hand? Why don't we do a cut in? Why don't we do a close up on that? Maybe there's something going on there. Maybe there's a story in that hand. And so as a filmmaker, you wouldn't just have it be talking heads. You would cut away to their jumping toe, or you'd cut away to their tapping hand on their knee. It shows something. It shows an emotion. It tells a story. And it's so much more than just having someone talk and having it on their face, saying some lines. And it's much more theater, right? It's much more theatrical. And this film teacher, I only had a small time working with him, but he had some really good points. And essentially, I've boiled it down to this. He was saying, bring theater to the film. He was saying, like, I want to be the audience in the theater, and I'm looking at the actor on stage tapping their hand. I'm looking at that. Show me that. And so that's what you start to do. You start to think, well, that tapping hand is not important. No, it's so important. That might be the character. You think they're telling the truth, and then we see their tapping hand, and that tells us, no, they're not telling the truth. It's these little things. And you don't have to say to the audience, oh, he's not telling the truth. You just see the tapping hand and you go, something's going on. Something's not right.
Oh, man. Yeah, there's so many different, like, the story about the teacher, I'm just like, oh, God, just roll my eyes at that kind of shit. It's like, it's one of the biggest pieces of advice. Like, if I was to, like, narrow down, like, a short list of, what are the main things to know about acting and acting well? Like, one of the things that's definitely in the top 5, if not in the top 3, is like, take the attention off of yourself. that's number one. That's like, yeah, that's definitely got to be top 3, I think. Where it's like, no, get the attention off of yourself and put it over what's going on the other person, because that's going to do, when you become, again, as my act teacher Larry used to say, he's like, you'll become interesting once you get interested. And it's like, and that means getting interested in the other person, getting it. And it's like, not in yourself and what you're doing. It's like, no, what's going on over there? Because they're going to tell you everything you need to do. And the weird thing is that all of these interesting behaviors start to come out of you as a result of taking the attention off of yourself. And then as I was just like, oh, what's happening? And you go, I was like, I didn't even realize I was doing that. Right. Like I've had that stuff happen. It's like, oh yeah, that moment in the scene, and you were like the way that you were standing in the door there and or whatever, just some weird little thing. And you just go, I had no idea I was even doing that. Yeah. And it's because of not thinking about myself. Because if I started thinking about myself in that moment, I would have probably started acting really fucking weird. That's just kind of how it goes. But you said something in there. There's a few things that you said. So like, I loved what you said. I think you nailed on the head. It's like, what does this thing need? Right? Like that's really what the exploration shows you. It's like, what are the things that it really needs? What are the actual really things of meaning? And that's so much of what like an artist is doing in the exploration of like, and because you've got to take the exploration and all of these things, and you can't say all of it. You can't put all of it in there because it would become way too unwieldy. It would become just so cumbersome. And you've got to find the things like, okay, what are the things that need to be said? What are the things that are the most meaningful to be put in here, right? And for different mediums, it requires a different kinds of things to make those kinds of calls, right? And it's and it's not necessarily means that what you do lessens what you create. And in fact, in many ways, that process is what actually gives it all the weight and is the way in which it can be best communicated. Because part of the thing of being an artist is that it's always handed off, right? And the audience fills in so much of what's going on. You could listen to people and have conversations with people about your favorite movies and books and stuff, and you can talk about the meanings of it, and the author might be like, oh shit, I never even thought about that. Like it's just like I'm like, I didn't even think about the thing that I was doing. Right. But that's kind of the magic of what can happen in the creative process. And when you take that attention off of yourself, is that these things emerge and people take it and they start to find those details, and they can even go beyond what you initially intended. Right. And that's an interesting part of it. And, I was thinking you talking about like screenwriting and how that is its own kind, has its own sort of demands and things that have to be sort of omitted in the process. And part of it is, it's going back to our old teacher, Ted Whittall, who, when we had him on the podcast, I don't know how long ago it was, but he had made this comment about basically a screenplay or stage play, whatever it is, that it doesn't have, I think he said, it doesn't have meaning outside of the performance. The script, because the script was always meant for performance, right? So that has a certain kind of effect on what you're trying to achieve within the script and within the story. And I think of that almost as, I have never done pottery. My wife does pottery, but I'm super, I love the whole creative process of it, because it does take skill to do, just like being a screenwriter. It requires skill and refinement of technique and all of these things to create something. But there's still this element of it where it's like, it's out of my hands. So you can, shape the clay, and then, you can carve into it, and you can put the glazes on for colors, but it's not, if you're making a cup, for example, you can do all of those things and it's still not a cup yet. You can't pour a liquid into that cup and use it. It's not solid. It has not yet come to form. It's got to be put into the fire. And that's kind of like when the writer's handing off the screen to the director and the actors, and and now it's like, we're filling it in, right, with the fire. right? And like, and the actors bringing, hopefully taking the cues and the clues and the things and the essence of what you've put in there, and they're expanding on it, right? And everybody's expanding on this thing, and then you've pulled this thing out of the fire, and suddenly you're like, whoa, holy shit. Like, I know I put that green color in there, but the way that it came out is so unexpected. That's the thing that's cool about pottery, is like, there's all these wild things that that happen in the kiln, and you don't see it happening. You just know it's going on. There's this process that's going on. Then it comes out and it's something amazing that you didn't have everything entirely to do with it. Yeah. But now it's actually a formed cup. You can use that thing. It is now the thing that it was supposed to be. And that's that sort of one of the things what I find so interesting and love about pottery is that there is a full knowledge and embracing that that's part of it. That thing that you labored over might just completely fucking blow up in the kiln. You might pull it out and go, oh shit. It blew up. It's in pieces. Right. But yeah. And I feel like there was one other thing. I feel like there was maybe one other thing in there. Maybe that was it. That might've been it that I had, but those are some thoughts I had or what you had there, Brandon.
Yeah, well, I guess it's probably getting to that witching hour, so I'm not going to labor on too much. But I would say that I guess there's a certain amount of you have to there is a little bit of a science that happens, I believe, with all art, like a certain math to it, and that should not be negated. So like, if you're making a cup or a bowl or something, there's a shape that contains, right? And if you ignore that shape and you put a hole in it, it's no longer a cup. It doesn't do what it is intended to do. So, in one of the first things that I do when I work with a new storyteller or writer is I teach them a technique, which is how to make their story workable. Because one of the biggest things that I notice with a lot of people, they think, oh, I'm no good at this. I can't do this. It's too hard. And I tried and they stop. Yeah, part of it is planning, like that is necessary, but there's a certain elements that need to be in place. Like there's ingredients. And if they're not there, it's not a workable story. You'd have nothing to work with. Like, for example, like if you were using pottery, I don't know, use clay or whatever. If you don't even have the clay, the material, you can't do it. Like it can't happen. There's a thing that needs to be present, right? So if you don't have the thing, you can't even do the work. And so like, I could imagine as a painter, like there's only certain strokes you could do with certain types of brushes or certain types of paint or whatever, or certain whatever. And so you have to understand your materials. You have to understand like what it is that you're working with and how, and you might not know how to use it yet. But one of the first things that I do with people is I go, here's a few elements that you're going to need to make a workable story. It doesn't mean it's going to be a good story. It doesn't mean that it's going to be marketable. It doesn't mean that it's going to sell. It just means that it's going to work. You're going to be able to go from beginning to end and take us on a journey. And those are the very fundamental skills. When I learned motorcycle riding, I was way beyond our initial lessons when we started. But the first lesson you start with is balance. Can you balance on two wheels? How are you going to ride a motorcycle if you can't? And you would think, oh, everybody knows how to balance, right? Not necessarily, not like they think they do. And so balance is the very first lesson you learn. And I would say art has a similar thing. It's like if you're going to ride a motorcycle, you need to learn how to balance on two wheels, right? If you're going to tell a story, we need to have a character who is going to go from one place to another place. Have that be physically, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, or whatever. There needs to be change. There needs to be a character. We at least need that. That's very basic, but these are like elements. So something about this conversation, I just wanted to bring that in because I think for the creative spirits out there, you think you're not good and you think, oh, I'll just keep thinking about it and I'll keep working on it and I'll feel my way through it. That's not going to work if you don't have the clay to make the pot in the pottery, then you're not going to do it. Like, you can't do it. It's not you. You're not working with the right tools, right? Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to kind of bring that into this conversation, because I always think, like, we get into some stuff, and you and I have been, I'm over 25 years. I'm pretty sure you're the same in this industry, like, or at least in the arts, right? We've done this for, over a couple decades, right? We have a lot of experience, and we've interacted with us a lot, and we can get into some big ideas around this stuff. And I love that our audience carries with us and goes on this journey with us, but I always like to leave people with some practical things. If you think you're not good at something, the first question you need to ask yourself is, like, do I even have the right tools? Am I even working with the stuff that can actually get this thing done? Because if you don't have that, it's not your fault. Like, and if you don't know what you need, that's your first thing. You have to figure that out. Because for me, like, I guess I'll say this, I'm going to pass it on to you in a moment, but I would say this, as I'm working on my novel right now, then I've written so many stories. I've done so much now. I mean, I teach people how to tell stories. I can think about these tools and I can think about how to use them, but I know what they are. It'd be very difficult for somebody who doesn't know this stuff to be able to do some of the things that I'm doing. Because if you just don't know them, you don't know what to think about. So if you don't even know what an inciting incident is in a story, and I'm going to go write a screenplay, and you don't even know what an inciting incident is, which is, I would say, a core essential element to storytelling, then you can't even stop to think about how you're going to enhance it, what you're going to do with it. So you're kind of like already going out into the ocean in a boat with like a hole in it. And it's like, oh, I can't sail. And it's like, no, you were sinking from the beginning. You didn't even leave in the right ship. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I just wanted to kind of point that out, because I feel like what we are talking about, when you have good tools and good kind of structure and foundations, and I'm not even saying you're good at those things yet, but you at least have them, then you can really start to like engage with, like, the space that we've been talking about. I feel like this conversation, and I feel like this is just one thing I want to say, I would say that this is a bit of an advanced conversation for the artists out there. I would say, like, this isn't step one. Like, if you're just like dabbling in the arts and you're like, hey, I want to be creative, I want to do this. I'm not saying that this isn't relevant. I think what we talked about is really important, but I also think that if you don't even have the foundations in place, sitting there and thinking creativity and thinking that things are just going to come together magically without any kind of like math to it all, you might find that you just struggle. And I wouldn't want to leave anybody with that, because I really truly believe in the creative process. Not to say don't create. I'm just saying that if you get stuck, don't blame yourself. Consider that you just might not have the knowledge or the tool yet in place. And it's not you. It's just that you don't know what tool you need to use yet. And that might be the question you need to ask, or the thing you need to search out. And then that will come and you'll realize, hey, this was a problem and now it isn't. So if you have thoughts, please share, but you're on beer, so I'm passing it to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I agree with what you're saying. And again, a lot of that just comes back down to like this explore kind of a thing as well, where it's coming in with that openness and curiosity can be the best thing to teach you of anything. I just recently saw a video of Russell Crowe talking about how he never went to school for acting, but he was curious about things. Same thing with Ian McKellen. I saw another thing. Ian McKellen, couldn't believe it. Ian McKellen had never been sort of formally trained in acting, but these were just two people who were super fascinated about people and behavior and creating that and doing that. And they learned so much just from watching people, observing other great actors, and they taught themselves out of genuine curiosity. So, the capacity to learn the tools of your craft are there for you no matter in like everywhere. So that was the one thing I would say to that. But yes, you do need them.
Yeah.
You do need them. You do need them, and then you eventually need to move beyond them. And that's a conversation that we've had before as well, but that's a whole other conversation. So the beer, this one, I got sucked in by the can when I bought this one. And this is called Steampunk Dunkel from Longwood Brewery, which is in Nanaimo, I believe I read on here. And yeah, it's like a dark ale. And I was a little bit concerned at first because I typically, it's on the maltier side, and I don't typically like the maltier ones, but it has actually, as I've been drinking it, it's been actually going down pretty nicely. It's sort of like the initial sort of shock of that maltiness, kind of like, okay, that's all past now, and now I'm just drinking it, and it's been good. Yeah. It's been good. Yeah.
Oh, I'd second that. I'd say very malty, very flavorful. Not my usual type of beer, but I've had a few Dunkels before, and yeah, it's flavorful. It's rich. It's like one of those ones where I always find like these very malty, like flavorful beers. I always like kind of during the cold seasons, and they have a time and a place, and this one's definitely got like a richness and flavor for sure. Evan, do you have some final thoughts? Do you have anything? Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. This is what this conversation has got me thinking about is something that, years and years ago, this was a thing that I had sort of as part of, I sort of taught it in some of my classes, my early years of teaching acting, and I kind of fell away from it, but it's something that crops up from time to time, and it's kind of come back to my head, and it's something that I'm like, oh, I should like go and dive into this a little bit more closely again. But is this sort of, I used to think of it as an equation, but now after this conversation, I'm thinking of it as more of like a cycle. It's like a trinity kind of a cycle. But that sort of cycle is explore, experience, express. And that's sort of this movement of the artist, of what you do as an artist, is there's this exploration, and there's this experience that you have through that exploration, and then you express that exploration and that experience. But in the expression, then that goes, it continues from there. And in the expression, you're still exploring it through the expression of it, because the expression of it is that's now a whole new thing that you're doing. And it repeats the cycle over again. And it's all kind of happening all at the same time. And I think that it's a useful kind of tool, I guess, for the artist in a way. And it's like, and coming back to where this all began, I think that a lot of those words, they do imply a sense of time and space, and allowing that yourself that in creativity, because like exploring and experiencing are things that yeah, like that there's no necessarily like goal to the whole thing, right? Like an exploration is just, I've wandered into a place open to seeing, to receiving, to whatever, and then there's the experience that just comes with that process, right? That comes through doing it. And I always like to think of like it as like what it does to you. What does that exploration do to you, right? And then that informs you of something, that teaches you something, that shows you something, that, it can be many things, but this is, I guess my final thoughts are like, this is almost a call to a certain degree to like to remember to like slow down, allow for that space, because that's where so much of the real creative, compelling work occurs. It is like, because I see exploration as like, even though it's a cycle, it's still a starting point, right? Like you have that creative itch, there's an idea, there's something that's planted there. Well, you've got to go into that. That's exploration. That's the first thing that occurs, right? And again, that requires time, space, and it doesn't necessarily have an agenda. It doesn't even necessarily know what it's supposed to be yet. That's why you have to do it, is because it's like you don't even know what the thing is supposed to be yet, right? It will start to show you that. And so we need to honor that process a little bit more, as opposed to having the idea of like, this needs to get somewhere, this needs to do this thing, this needs to, well, it's like just slow it down, see what happens, allow this thing some room to breathe. Because like, we use that expression, room to breathe, which implies that the thing is, it's a living thing that you're dealing with, right? This is a living thing that you're dealing with when you're creating something, like it's not it's not something that's already that's set in stone. Like this is a wily thing. It's living, and you're in a relationship with it. You're engaging with it. And so, you need to give it in many ways the things that you would give any kind of living thing. And you can't always force it or push it. You've got to give it space.
Yeah, well, I agree with what you're saying. And I think the thought that comes to my mind is, don't try to make something happen, let something happen. And it's when I think about storytelling now, a lot of it for me is about setting up circumstances or situations or dynamics, or I have an idea or an inspiration, and then I let that unfold. And what's been really interesting about, well, I have several stories that I've been working on, but I've really just dialed into this novel now, and this is like my sole focus, and I just put the other ones on the shelf, even though they're very well developed. But even when I was working on several, and when I'm working on this one, I found that attention is magic. That's something that you said a long time ago, and that's always stuck with me. I'm like, that for sure is one of my truths. Like, I've just taken that on as something. So it's like, if I want something to like blossom or like take life, I just got to give it attention. I just need to put energy towards it. I don't need to make it become anything. I don't need to tell it what it is. I just need to like focus on it, energy towards it, attention, think about it, work on it, whatever it might be. And then it will reveal itself to me. So with these stories, something that's been very interesting as I've been going through them is, over the course of the last several months, I would say, if not the last year, I've redeveloped my entire story structure model. Like, it's similar, but it's just changed and it's evolved. And the reason why it changed and evolved was because the one that I was working with was something that I developed when I was very young, and it made a lot of sense, and it works. It definitely works. I've moved things forward with it. But there was these, like, as I learned more about story and I got older and I just figured more things out, I'm like, there's just like this thing's missing and that thing's missing. And like, I would go to these like almost like outside sources to kind of pull them in, and it never really felt complete. And so I was like, I sat down one day and I'm like, let me just kind of like take everything and just kind of put it together into like the one package as much as I can and try to get it to do what I need it to do. And I got it dialed in pretty good, and it gets refined a little bit as I go along. But what's very interesting is that I'll work out a story like from beginning to end, and I'll have all the beats and everything figured out. And then I'll go to write it and it'll change. And I'll be like, oh man, like all that work I did is kind of like, now it's kind of getting thrown out the window. And then I'll just do it again. I'll just revise it again. And okay, that changes this. And now here we go. Here it is. And that'll happen this happened like several times over. But I wouldn't call any of that a waste of time. It's kind of like I have this theory of what the story is going to be. So the first thing is I write it down. It's like, here's my theory on what the story is. Then I start working on it. And then it goes, well, your theory was right here, but it's incorrect over here. And then it kind of takes a life of its own. And it shows me something. And I go, okay, great. So let's kind of, now that I know this, I'm gonna go back to the drawing board. Let's plan this out again. And that was like, I was saying earlier that I could have written this novel like a few months ago. That version of it was definitely a workable version. And I thought it was a pretty good version. But I could tell that it had a life of its own. And it was saying, if you let me, I'm going to show you something else. Something that you've been incapable of seeing up to this point, but you have to let me. And so that's kind of the way I would say it kind of works for me with storytelling. And that's what this story in particular has taught me the most. The others did help with this as well, but that I have to, if I get that kind of like, the best I could almost say is like that calling out in the woods or that like knock on the door. And it's like, are you going to let me in? Are you going to come out here and see what I have for you? And it's like, well, that means I got to let go of some things. And it's like, well, it's up to you. And it's like, okay, let's do it. It's like, wow, I'm so glad I answered that. I'm so glad you're like, and it's just, this story has taken a life of its own that there's no way that I ever could have come up with what I've come up with now simply by just logically, piece by piece, putting it together. There was just life that was born. And so I'll go back to an earlier story. I did share this on an earlier podcast, but for example, one of the characters initially, it was like the main character and his wife. They were very important characters in this particular story. And at a certain point, the wife, I was like, well, it'd be better if it was a sister. And then I was like, and I had that knock on the door or that calling in the woods, kind of thing. It's like, well, try it. I'll show you what'll happen. And it's like, well, fine, let's change it. And so I did it and I explored that and it took it in this really amazing way. But at a certain point, I was like, well, the wife character had something about it that I don't really want to lose. And it's like, well, there's room, put her back in. But now she's almost like a new character. She was like born again. Also, the kid, his son, is like 17 in this story. When I started writing this story, the kid was like 7 or 8 years old. And what's so interesting is that I got to meet the son when he was 7 or 8 years old. And now I see him as a teenager. So it's like I've grown up with him. I got to see this like decade of life that happened for him between when he was a little kid and when he's like a teenager. And it's like, that's just lived in, you know what I'm saying? So that's that space that I'm talking about. And I don't really know how to explain it other than I think if you're creating and you get some kind of like inclination or some type of like calling or knock on the door. I don't know how you want to use it. What analogy is a good expression? I think I just used them all that work for me. But it's just like answer the door or go follow that calling. Just go out there and see what it shows you, and trust that there's something deep down inside of you in your creative realm that is just begging to come out, and you won't know it until it's revealed.
Thank you for listening in on our conversation today. We hope you found something helpful that you can carry forward with you. Head over to our website, wayoftheartist.com, for more free exclusive material and learn about the show. If you haven't already, please support us by subscribing to the show, sharing it with people you know, and keeping compassionate, creative conversation going.